So the subgeneral anterior cingulate is the last component of which we have not talked yet. And so the subgeneral anterior cingulate is important because it is involved in value and in arousal. So if you do meta-analysis of how does the brain process what is valuable to you, then what you see is that it's predominantly involves, of course, the nucleus accumbens, the pregeneral anterior cingulate, and the subgeneral anterior cingulate, as well as the caudate nucleus. So value is overlaps largely with the network that we have seen, which encodes motivation. Now, arousal from a meta-analytic point of view, of course, involves the amygdala, involves the subgeneral anterior cingulate, the pregeneral and the rostral to dorsal part of the anterior cingulate, as well as the insula. So it involves both a salience network component, a descending inhibitory component, but also a value component. So looking at the functional connectivity from the subgeneral anterior cingulate, it informs the dorsal anterior cingulate to get more if it's of value, but it is influenced, of course. What is valuable critically depends on the intention that you have, and as well as the context. So the combination of context and intention will determine whether something is valuable, and that will then drive the anterior cingulate to get more information, or to modulate the pregeneral anterior cingulate to suppress information. So it is a critical node that basically creates or is involved in a balance between give me more and I have enough, as you can also see from the connectivity, and that the connectivity is correlated with suppression and suppresses the give me more area. So in summary, if there is uncertainty, but it is important, then you need more information. This will be linked to a dorsal attentional, to a dorsal anterior cingulate activation, which will look for more input. This input, if it solves the uncertainty, then you will feel pleasure, and you will suppress further input and store whatever you have done in memory. Now, and that will then be followed by inhibition of action, because if you have enough information, if uncertainty is reduced, you don't need any more information. Now, if the problem hasn't been solved, then you will reactivate the dorsal part, which will basically keep on going into a loop, and that will ultimately result in stress. Now we then move on to the insula. We've discussed the insula before, and in a small summary, if you look at the insula consists of three components: a dorsal component, which is cognitive, a ventral component, which is affective, and a posterior component, which is basically extraceptive. These areas are connected differentially, so the posterior part is connected to the sensory, somatosensory cortex, visual cortex, auditory cortex, and is and that's why it is extraceptive. The dorsal part of the anterior insula is related to your rostral part of the anterior insula, to the central executive network, and might therefore be more cognitive, whereas the ventral anterior part of the insula is correlated more to the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala, and therefore might be more effective in its components. So this connectivity, of course, is very important. The cognitive processing goes to the dorsolateral, prefrontal, and parietal network, so basically to your central executive network that extends here to the temporoparietal junction as well. Whereas the ventral part of the anterior insula connects to your affective processing, orbitofrontal cortex and temporal tip, but also to your superior temporal sulcus. So It also processes socially relevant information, whereas the posterior part is involved in sensory motor control, auditory control, visual control, but also olfactory and gustatory processing. So depending on which part of the insula is involved, you get different connectivity profiles. With regards to salence processing, which is what we've been discussing, actually the ventral part is the most relevant component. And this of course brings us fairly easily to the next topic, which is going to be emotions. Now, emotions can be defined as a value-based prediction to process specific stimuli with priority within a certain context, meaning that emotion ultimately leads us to prioritize what is relevant for us, and therefore it has to be linked to the salience network, of course. So emotions can be model-free, which means they can be very reflexive, non-conscious, fast, rigid, you make no mistakes. So it can be, for this stimulus, as a reflex, I get that emotion. In seeing pain, for example, you will get a specific emotion. In disgust, a lot of the basic emotions might actually have a model-free emotional response, but they can also be model-based, where it is intentional or goal-directed. So instead of reflexive, it's more reflective, because it has a model to compute. It will be slower and than a model-free emotion, but it may be flexible, and of course you may make mistakes. Now, there is multiple theories of emotions, but the most important ones are the ones that was generated by William James, and then combined in James Lange theory of emotion. And this is contradicted by Walter Cannon and Barth, who basically said the opposite. So conceptually, if you see a stimulus, an emotional stimulus such as a snake, then what can happen is that will activate your autonomic nervous system to run away, to get ready to run away from the dangerous stimulus, and this might then be interpreted by your brain and generate a feeling of fear. So that is basically a kind of a bottom-up generation of fear, where the fear is the result of your brain interpreting signals that come from your body. Now, the Cannon-Barth theory is the opposite, where you see a snake, because it's a snake, your brain says, oh, this is dangerous, and therefore that will activate your autonomic nervous system to respond in a particular way. Then the two-factor model of Schachter and Singer actually is somewhat similar to the James Lange theory, but basically what it does is you see a danger signal that creates an arousal response, a sympathetic arousal. Your brain interprets this as a dangerous signal, and therefore you will respond with a certain fear. So but this can of course lead to misattribution of arousal. A practical example is nice research that happened in the Capilano suspension bridge close to Vancouver. What misattribution of arousal means is that people can make a mistake in assuming what's causing them to feel aroused. For example, when people are experience arousal, sympathetic arousal, because they're crossing this very high suspension bridge, then they mislabel this arousal, for example, as romantic arousal. This was done by research, where a beautiful-looking female researcher was standing at the end of the bridge, and after men crossed the bridge, they were asked to participate in an experiment. And they could call her for more information afterwards. And so men were more likely to call her when they crossed this suspension bridge than when they crossed a more solid bridge across the river. suggesting that the arousal that was generated by fear actually was misinterpreted to the beautiful lady as more romantic arousal. And so that kind of supports the idea that it is really that an emotion, when it becomes a feeling, a conscious feeling, that it is actually a conscious interpretation. And so it's the interpretation aspect, which is an extra factor to the James Lange theory, which is more a model free approach. Now, there has been a long ongoing discussion whether emotions are really discrete in the sense that they're all separate and linked to separate brain networks that are then generating this specific, for example, innate emotional response to specific stimuli. And this has been a discussion that is going on. And of course, there is some arguments that look at bodily sensations. So if you have an emotion, then you can ask people, where do you feel this emotion in your body? And that will be different for different emotions. For example, happiness and love are perceived not just in the head or brain, but also in the chest and of course the abdomen, where you feel butterflies in your stomach. And this is very much into contrast to, for example, depression, where people feel kind of coldness, numbness, inactivity, and specifically arms and legs, which correlates with sadness. But sadness is different from depression in that there is still some activity present in contrast to a depression. Shame, of course, is felt in the head and the cheeks, which is easily recognizable. And so these body maps, and the question is, are these indeed perceived if the emotion might actually be generated in the body? Then does that indeed support the James Lange or the two-factor model for emotions? Now, emotions actually are overlapping with the autonomic nervous system, which makes sense in the sense that it's the autonomic nervous system that generates the feeling of, for example, palpation or the tachycardia associated with emotion, or the feelings coming from the intestines and stomach, as mentioned, when people fall in love. And these are, of course, related to reward, but they have to be related to the self. And of course, the self is also related to our default mode network and our memory network, just demonstrating that there is an overlap between default mode network activity and then the autonomic reward emotional network. So there is an overlap, and this overlap is predominantly in our self-perceptional network. Now, as mentioned, value consists predominantly of nucleus accumbens as well as subgenual anterior cingulate going over into the orbitofrontal cortex. But the question then is an emotion driven by our autonomic nervous system and then interpreted as highly valuable, so that it drives us to respond with priority. Now, interoception, or is basically means that it's sensory input that comes from receptors located inside the body, as opposed to the receptors on our body that are activated by external stimuli. So this definition goes back to Sherrington, and basically you can also define it as visceral sensory input. And interoception then informs your brain how well our body is energetically functioning, whether there is no infections or inflammations in our body, whether we are not thirsty. So it informs the brain about the condition of our body at a certain moment. Now, this goes via sympathetic afferents as well as the parasympathetic afferents, which follow a different pathway but ultimately go to the insula on the left and right, but predominantly on the left for the parasympathetic system and predominantly to the right for the sympathetic nervous system. Now, so the insula is therefore very important for informing the brain about the condition of our body, and depending on how much input goes to the insula and how much goes to the, for example, anterior cingulate, so to our salence network, that will create a different valence, or that will tell you whether the stimulus is unpleasant or pleasant. So the same area of the salence network is actually involved in telling the brain whether food is pleasant or unpleasant, for example. So emotions are basically predictions, just like our brain predict. Ultimately, the goal of our brain is to predict the future. So emotions are predictions of basically non-conscious and automatic responses to salient stimuli. That is a definition that Joseph Ledoux has given already 30 years ago. And emotions are basically an arousal to fight or to run away, to feed or to make love. So emotion is ultimately an arousal to do or to respond in a specific way. And so Paul Ekman has called 6 basic emotions, which might be genetically inherited and discrete emotions such as fear, anger, disgust, happiness, sadness, and surprise. This is cross-culturally, so in every culture, those same 6 basic emotions are being found. And it is suggested that you also have complex emotions like pity, schadenfreude, envy, contempt, etc. And they might actually be a combination of those basic emotions. So for example, anger and disgust could then be perceived phenomenologically as contempt. Now, in contrast to emotions, which are basically predictions of unconscious responses to salient stimuli, feelings is the conscious interpretation of the emotion. So basically it's the psychological or mental perception of the emotional response. So which is very similar to what we've seen before in different neurological processes where mirroring is an unconscious prediction, and then mentalizing is the interpretation of mirroring. Here an emotion is very similar, that an emotion is unconscious, and that basically a feeling is then a conscious interpretation of the emotion. You could also link that to sensation and perception for sensory stimuli, whereas if the sensory stimulus reaches up to the sensory cortex, somatosensory cortex, auditory cortex, visual cortex, that is ultimately leads to sensation, to the activation of the sensory network, but as long as there is no interpretation given to that stimulus, there is no perception. So for emotions, Joseph Ledoux has suggested that if you have an emotional stimulus that goes to the thalamus and then via what he calls the low road directly to the amygdala, and then you get an emotional response in the amygdala. But there is also what he calls the high road, and the high road then goes to the cortex, and from the cortex it goes to the amygdala, and it may modify the emotional response. So you have your emotional stimulus goes to the thalamus via the low route to the amygdala, and then from the amygdala you inform the hypothalamus to get an endocrine and rage or fight response, and you can also get the amygdala then to inform the brainstem to get noradrenaline to be released, your serotonin and your dopamine, but also to differentially activate sympathetic and parasympathetic system For example, leading to the polyvagal mechanism, which we have seen is that when everything is safe, your myelinated vagus is active. When there is danger, but it is still in control, then your vagal nervous system is still active, but you get some activation of the sympathetic system. If you are in danger, but it is not really in control, you only get activation of your sympathetic system. And if you're in a life-threatening situation, then your sympathetic system shuts down and your unmyelinated vagus might actually become activated, as suggested in the polyvagal theory. Now, it is interesting that Charles Darwin already looked at the fact that emotion, at least the expression of emotion, is very similar in throughout the phylogenetic tree, and that ontogenetically it has been suggested that actually arousal leads to distress, that arousal is the first emotion that ontogenetically develops, and that sequentially you get more complex emotions to arise. Now, emotions are thus interpretations of how well or bad the condition is of our body, and of course this can be looked at from an autonomic nervous system point of view. And here you have a review of all the changes that have been noted in the autonomic nervous system. But what you can see is that, for example, sympathetic activity is, or arousal in other words, is active in most of the basic emotions associated with both alpha and beta adrenergic activity. But that, and what is interesting is that it is associated with cholinergic activity as well. But depending on the emotion, that you can have either a decrease in vagal nerve or an increase in vagal nerve activity. Now, so how should we then conceive of emotions? Well, you can conceive of emotions analogous to what has been shown for the benzene ring. So the benzene ring is the basic building block of a lot of different basic plastics. So depending on what you add to that benzene ring, you can have polystyrene plastics, such as you have in DVD cases, in disposable razors, in building and insulation packaging material, etc. But if you add a different molecule to the benzene ring, then you can create phenols, which are basically polycarbonates, as found in lenses, glasses, DVDs itself, plastic bottles, electronic material, etc., or in epoxy resin glues, or in bakelite. Or if you add even a different constituent to the building block, then you get polyurethane foams, like in shoe soles, automotive interiors, bedding, etc. But ultimately, you have one building block that allows you to develop different kinds of plastics. So conceptually, you can say the same thing about emotions, is that emotions are based on arousal, and that is the basic building block of emotions. And indeed, if you do a meta-analysis of arousal, what you see is that you get activity in the amygdala, in the nucleus accumbens, as well as in the value areas, and the suppression and give me more, and suppressive areas. And if you use a different meta-analytic study, where you do a meta-analysis and do a conjunction analysis, looking at what do all these areas, what do all these words have in common, then if you combine arousal with the six basic emotions, then what you get is, of course, amygdala activity associated with a little bit of parahippocampus and insula activity. So you have a core benzene network, basically, that overlaps with the arousal network. And then if you do different meta-analysis, then you can see how this basic network is a component of fear, anger, happiness, sadness, and disgust. And that's a conceptually easy way of looking at emotions, where you have arousal as a basic building block, and that makes sense from the James Lange theory, where looking at the snake will activate your arousal autonomic nervous system, and then depending on the arousal and where it is connected to, that basic building block will lead to fear, will lead to anger, will lead to happiness, sadness, or disgust. Now, so this arousal network has been defined, and for example, if you look at your basic or primitive emotions, then fear is this arousal network, and the difference between fear and anger is that, of course, in fear that might be undirected. You feel fear, but you don't know yet what. If you are fearful, but that drives you to become anger, then that anger is following interpretation. And the biggest difference, of course, as you can see, between fear and anger is the presence of activity in the uncertainty processing area, which with anger is not there. When you're angry, there might still be fear, but there is no uncertainty anymore, because ultimately you're attacking. If you're angry, you're focusing your energy on to attack, driven by the arousal system, but there is no uncertainty left, because otherwise you probably would not be angry and attacking, but running away. Now, some people are fearless, and this is interesting. SM is the initials of a famous person who was equally famous as HM for the hippocampus. SM is the analog for the amygdala. So she lost her amygdala. Basically, they became completely calcified and dysfunctional to a genetic, a rare genetic disease, the Urbach-Wiete disease, at the age of 10. Now, this is very important that it is at the age of 10, because that means that in the initial critical period, she has known emotions, because it's not that she was born without an amygdala. So this Urbach-Wiete disease is rare. Only about 300 cases have been described, and it is predominantly present in Dutch, South Africans, and Khoisan people. Now, SM herself, she lived in a dangerous, poor, and violent neighborhood. So she was prone to aggression and the associated emotions, of course. She has been attacked multiple times at gunpoint, at knife point, but she has no post-traumatic stress. She has no. She says, well, it's part of where I live. It's actually she doesn't consider it to be emotionally disturbing to live in that dangerous and violent neighborhood. She has no fear for snakes, not when you can show her the grossest movies or even the personal attacks. But what's important is that she also doesn't recognize fear in others, nor other social stimuli. So she trusts everybody and has no fear of giving trust to even the strangers that might look aggressive, or that might look not very familiar. So, because she does not recognize any danger, she interestingly also has no peripersonal space. So, in general, she comes a lot closer to people than what other prefer to have a specific distance. So, her peripersonal space is not present, but she can remember fear from before the age of 10. But it's not just limited to fear. She also doesn't recognize sadness. She doesn't feel sad on hearing sad music. So in general, it's more than just being fearless. She's very outgoing, very friendly, and completely uninhibited. She basically approaches others indiscriminately. But she does not have a complete lack of fear, because when she was inhaling CO2 in the scanner, what happens is that she was actually developing fear and even panic attacks, even to a bigger extent in controls, which is surprising, but that suggests actually that the low route from the amygdala to the brainstem nuclei might not be necessary, and that the information could go, that the interoceptive stimuli associated with a lack of oxygen might actually go directly to the brainstem, bypassing the amygdala, because that's what's going to keep you alive, whereas exteroceptive stimuli might pass via the amygdala. So the low route might actually even bypass the amygdala, and the emotional or the life-saving stimulus might go directly to the brainstem, so that there is not even an interpretation of that stimulus, and then generate the feeling associated with fear. So a feeling is basically an interpretation of an emotion. It's a conscious interpretation of the emotion, and what you see is that you've got activation of your arousal network, as we've seen before, but associated with that you get activation of your default mode network, as well as your and this of course is a combination of the interpretation to the emotional stimulus, just like we saw in mirroring, where the mentalizing associated with mirroring, the perception, the interpretation of it involves default mode. And here you see exactly the same, that a feeling is an emotion with associated default mode network activation. Now, if a feeling involves a default mode network activation, then you would expect that happiness, which is the interpretation of a positive stimulus, might actually overlap with the default mode, and that it might overlap with the parasympathetic nervous system, which is activated when you rest and digest. So when your bodily condition gives information to your brain, all is good, then you might feel happy, and this happiness should be interpreted consciously in the default mode network. And so what you see is that there is indeed a large overlap. Now this comes from the cognitive part of the insula. Interestingly, it comes from the cognitive part of the insula, which then connects to the salience network as well as the default mode network. So basically, well-being or happiness is a cognitive interpretation of the fact that your body is in a good condition, and therefore you will feel happy or feel well-being. So the default mode network activity does correlate with sympathetic activity and pleasantness, and it of course makes sense. This has been shown in another study where naturalistic sounds, while you're mind wandering, they induce activity in the left insula, and we know the left insula is predominantly activated with parasympathetic activity, and this has been confirmed by looking at mean peak of the heart rate variability, and this is associated with more pleasantness. Now, so yes, naturalistic sounds, when you might wonder, do activate your sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, creating more pleasantness, and this is due to connectivity increase between your PCC, which we know is the hub of the parasympathetic nervous system, extending to the precuneus as well as to the anterior insula, and as you can see also the dorsal component of the anterior insula, so the cognitive component, as well as the hedonic part of your brain, which is your pregenital anterior cingulate. So happiness in itself, which is very similar semantically to well-being, is associated with connectivity and activity in those areas that I just mentioned before. And then the question is, of course, can we induce happiness? Can we induce well-being, for example, by increasing the connectivity to the posterior cingulate, to the parasympathetic network, which is what we did with infraslow neurofeedback, and what you could see in those patients, that when we modified or increased the activity in the PCC, extending into the precuneus, that this actually correlates with an increase of well-being, only if they were treated and not in placebo, and that it is especially in those patients who had low scores of well-being in contrast to those who have high scores of well-being, and this is actually associated with a change in the PCC. So that suggests that if you modify the PCC, that this indeed correlates with the amount of increase that you get in well-being. Now, the question is, well, if you have this benzene network, so to call, of arousal, then this arousal may connect to other areas involved in happiness and sadness. But what if those? How would you then? How would the brain differentiate between happiness and sadness? And as mentioned, well, there is this possibility of a inverted U-curve where some activity may be perceived as pleasant, other activity as unpleasant, and this could in itself be related for the same network, but just where the internal connectivity is different, and that might actually then lead to a different emergent property of the same network, but with different internal connectivity. And this is what you see in sadness and happiness, that ultimately the brain activation patterns are exactly the same between happiness and sadness, but that it might be, and this has still to be shown, that the connectivity between those similar areas ultimately determines whether you are feeling happy or sad. And with that, we end the discussion of emotions, but one of the aspects that we haven't talked about yet is something like free will. Free will means I could have done otherwise. That's a very simple definition of free will. Defined in a little different way, free will is the capacity to choose from different options in the same situations with some degree of anticipation of the consequences of each choice. So free will critically involves this prediction or the anticipation of the consequences of each choice. So free will critically, of course, involve the self, because without a self-perception you can't have free will, and that you could have done otherwise. Now this is related intrinsically to whether your belief is dualistic or monistic. So in dualism, your mind lives on after the body dies. There is an eternal mind that continues to live even after the brain or the body has ceased to do so. This goes back in history to Zarathustra, who suggested already 3,000 years ago that the mind and the body are composed of distinct substance. This was taken over by Plato and then entered the Christian world via St. Augustine, who used Plato's concepts and Christianized them. This dualism actually got into science via Descartes, who suggested that there was an immaterial mind and a material body, but that they were truly ontologically distinct substances and that interact in some way. According to Descartes, that would happen in the pineal gland. And as we've seen, Duncan McDougall then did a study with humans who were about to die, and he was putting their bets on tools to weigh the weight of the body, and when they ceased to live or when they died, basically he calculated the difference in weight before and immediately after that, and in a group of 6 patients he then decided that basically the soul had a weight of 21 grams. Now monism is the opposite of dualism, in the sense that monism says if the body dies, the mind ceases to exist. So the mind and body are intrinsically linked to each other, and if the body dies, the mind dies, in contrast to dualism, where if the body dies, the mind continues to live to live afterwards as a soul going to heaven or to hell. Now, monism basically goes back to the pre-Socratic philosophers, where Thales thought everything was water, and Anaximenes said everything was air, Heraclitus that fire was the basis of everything. But the most basic concept of monism was Democritus, who described atoms as the basis of thoughts and feelings and the self. So we are constructed of atoms, and these atoms disappear, our mind and soul will also cease living. This was then maintained throughout philosophical history. For example, Thomas Hobbes and Karl Marx were basically monists. Now, of course, if you have a free will, then that would suggest that you mind can do things without being determined by how your brain works. And indeed, if you look at free will, it is predominantly people who are dualistic, who have a feeling in free will, whereas people who are monistic or reductionist physicalists, basically that does not correlate with free will, but reductionist physicalists, those monists, actually believe in determinism, whereas dualists do not believe in determinism. So free will is typically for people who have a dualistic philosophy, and they do not believe in scientific determinism. Whereas monistic people actually, as exemplified by reductionist physicalism, they don't believe in free will, but they believe in scientific determinism. And which one of the two is more common? Well, actually, in both in the USA and in Singapore, dualism is still very dominant, and that's also why still most of the people still believe in free will. But there is some who do believe in deterministic. So they, depending on how you question it, you might get to different responses. Now, then there is in between those two extremes of monism and dualism, there is something which could be called emergentist monism. And this goes back to Aristotle, who in his book Metaphysics and the Anima writes that the whole is something over and above its parts and not just the sum of them all. So basically, we could interpret that, and he also writes it, that the soul is actually form and soul. So it could be an emergent property from connectivity. And this is also what John Stuart Mill wrote in A System of Logic, where the emergent properties amount to more than the sums of the properties of their parts. And so when he was looking at hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms, then he would notice that they have different properties, but that the properties of water, which is a combination of two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, actually could not be predicted or is different from the characteristics of the individual oxygen and hydrogen atoms. So it's basically, he suggested that it is a chemical reaction or the connectivity between the hydrogen and the oxygen atom that ultimately creates the emergent properties. And this was even pushed a step further by Edwin Schrödinger, who says, well, you have isomers, they are made up of exactly the same atoms, but they're differently connected, they're differently arranged, and that results in different physical properties. For example, L and D glucose are exactly the same glucose molecules, they're just mirroring each other, and one of the two can be used by the body as a substrate for energy, whereas the other cannot be used as an energy for substrate. And then Francis Crick basically brought that into research for consciousness, when in his book An Astonishing Hypothesis, he already writes in the first page that while the whole may not be the simple sum of its separate parts, its behavior can, at least in principle, be understood from the nature and behavior of its parts. And then comes the most critical part of the sentence, plus the knowledge of how these parts interact. So it's the interactions, it's the connectivity that ultimately results in the emergent property. Now to go back to free will is a very old principle, but was not present in the early societies, because before the pre-Socratics, actually gods control nature and mankind. So it is a mythological world where there is no free will. Whatever happens is controlled by the gods. Now, Thales of Miletus was the first philosopher who started to looking for rules, which is called logos, in contrast to the mythos, where the gods explain everything. Thales was the first known philosopher who was actually looking for laws or rules in nature, rather than the gods to explain how nature functions. And for him, a god is that which shapes and creates all things from water. So he was allowing free will to develop, but it was still religious enough or believing enough to say, well, ultimately God still decides, but God might create the rules. Anaximander was actually the first true cosmologist who says, well, we don't need God anymore to explain the rules that are there, explain how nature works. So for him, cosmos was basically organized nature, and logos was the law that organizes nature rather than God who organizes nature. So from that point of view, basically free will does not exist either, because it is the logos that creates it. And Heraclitus then later on says that indeed it's the laws that govern everything, how everything moves, and it's the unity of opposites, basically the yin and the yang, that it's a balance between, but this balance is controlled by rules as well, that ultimately depends who we are. Now, Lysippus is a fairly unknown philosopher, was very important for free will, because he says, well, basically laws and rules organize nature, and this is very important, they are universal. So he was the first atomist actually, and Democritus, who became famous as the first atomist, actually was his pupil. And what Lysippus said, well, nothing occurs at random. So there is no randomness whatsoever, but everything happens for a reason and by necessity. Basically that means that there is a world with only one future, which is completely determined by the past. So free will cannot exist in this world concept of Lysippus. And Democritus, who was the teacher, the pupil of Lysippus, then said, well, all matter is composed of small indivisible atoms, and these have random collisions. A little bit later, or more recent, than Epicurus, who we all know as an Epicurist, who says that we have that ultimately the purpose of life is to look for pleasure and reduce pain, said that some things happen out of necessity, but others by chance, and others through our own agency. So here there is a way of looking at free will, because what he suggests that atoms might actually deviate from their expected course, thus permitting humans to possess free will in an otherwise deterministic universe. So Epicurus was looking for a way out to try and explain free will, and then Aristotle basically said that every cause is determined by a previous cause, and the first mover is God. So God basically started everything, and then everything was following different rules with based on four different causes, which are matter, form, cause and effect, and purpose. And but he also suggested that actually there's something like Tuche, which means there is a chance by accident. So, following in the steps of Epicurus, basically, he said there is an uncaused cause, which you could consider fifth cause, and that allows for some kind of indeterminism. Now, Lucretius is a very interesting figure because he really was actually a proto-Darwinist, and still being an atomist, like Leucippus, Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius basically said that atoms move according to Brownian motion, which we know they do, and this allows for free will. He also talked about evolution, where he believed that nature experiments endlessly across very long periods in time, and that ultimately the organism that adapts best to the environment has the best chance of surviving. So this is really Darwinism avant la lettre. And then St. Augustine basically said, well, the logos, the law that organizes nature, is God. But God is omnipotent and benevolent. Therefore, creating free will liberates God from allowing evil. So free will, according to Augustine, was when God gave free will to humans, actually it explains why there is evil, because God intrinsically is benevolent and omnipotent, but because he gave humans free will, that explains why there is evil. And Thomas Aquinas then says that actually freedom is a manner in which, from a cognitive or intellectual point of view, we try to seek goodness. So intellect moves the will. Free will is a cognitive function. So free will consists basically of two different large subgroups: determinism and indeterminism. And determinism in itself can be subdivided in compatibilism. So determinism basically means that the previous state of the system determines only one possible future state. So everything is determined. Indeterminism, on the other hand, says that the previous state of a system can lead to multiple different next states. So there is freedom, or nothing is really determined by the previous state, because there is multiple different possibilities. Now, within determinism, there is compatibilism, and compatibilism basically say free will and determinism are compatible, and there is a lot of people who philosophers who are compatibilists, and there is hard determinists. Basically, hard determinists say no. Basically, the previous state determines only one possible future state, so there is no way that there can be free will, and these are other philosophers that defend the philosophy of hard determinism. And then there is libertarianism, which of course are mostly dualists, such as these people, which basically say that there is full freedom and nothing is determined by the past. So both hard determinists and libertarians are incompatibilists, in contrast to compatibilists. And incompatibilism basically say free will is incompatible with determinism, both from the two extremes. Now, since then, of course, philosophy has developed a lot, and the free will discussion has become more difficult, with more recently a very interesting two-stage model with little determinism and limited indeterminism. Some people have looked at quantum physics to biologically or physically try to explain free will. So, in order to understand their reasoning, you have to understand a little bit of network science, and the Barabasi-Albert model says that networks grow by preferential attachment. So the rich get richer, and this of course creates a first mover advantage, where the first by definition becomes the biggest. So the rich get richer, meaning that everybody wants to connect to the most powerful hub in the network. And this creates a first mover advantage, which ultimately does not happen in real life. So, for example, before Google came to the market, there were already web browsers, but they had the first mover advantage, but ultimately Google became the biggest, and therefore they developed a second model. Barabasi developed a second model, which is the Bianchino Barabasi model, where it says, well, networks grow by preferential attachment, but not only, they also grow by fitness, which means the capacity of a node to attract more nodes. What it suggests is that it's survival of the fittest node. So that even though this node might have been the first, that this node does become bigger. So quantum mechanics has been called to the rescue of free will, with the idea that it is different from classical Newtonian physics. Classical Newtonian physics basically suggests that if you know the state of a system, you can perfectly predict what the outcome of the measurement will be, as it follows applied physical formulas. Very linear physical formulas. If you know A, you can predict B. However, in quantum physics, there is different interpretation, and some of them are indeterministic and some are deterministic. So it's not so that every explanation for quantum physics, and I think here you see more than 10 different versions of or interpretations of quantum physics, and then if you see basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are deterministic, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are indeterministic. So it's almost half of the interpretation of quantum physics are indeterministic and half are deterministic, suggesting that there is not one truth coming from quantum mechanics. So the basics of this discussion is how much you believe in the wave function collapse. But from a practical point of view, in quantum mechanics, the state of a system is a supposition of all possible measured outcomes. And this is known as the wave function. So the wave function basically is a statistical item which is a superposition of all possible measurement outcomes. So the wave function is a combination of every result you could get by doing an observation. And in quantum mechanics, the state of a system can evolve in two very different ways. If you leave the system alone, so one way occurs when we're not observing the system, and during this stage the wave function follows the Schrödinger equation. So the wave function can be described, and which is reversible and fully deterministic, just like classical Newtonian mechanics. So quantum mechanics are deterministic if you don't look at it or if you don't examine it. However, when we examine it or when we observe the state, the wave function collapses and some outcome is measured which is indeterministic, meaning it cannot be predicted even when we know the previous state. So quantum mechanics therefore only predicts probabilities, and this has suggested to some people, well, maybe quantum mechanics does allow for free will. Now, Barabasi has looked at it from a different way, and he looked at the Bose-Einstein condensate. Basically, the Bose-Einstein condensate says that at normal temperatures, bosons, or by extension probably atoms in a gas, are individually separate particle waves, each with their own velocity based on their energy. Now, when you get close to absolute zero, those individually separate particle waves, they slow down and they fuse to become one big undistinguishable particle wave with one velocity, because of the low energy that they have, and that creates a phase transition into a new form of matter. So whereas in normal temperatures those atoms are basically separable, at close to absolute zero they all fuse to become something different. This Bose-Einstein condensate is interesting because Barabasi Biancioni has shown that complex adaptive networks, and the brain is a complex adaptive networks, actually they demonstrate Bose-Einstein statistics. And you can conceive of a complex network as a huge quantum gas. So if you look at a complex network as a quantum gas, then you can apply those Bose-Einstein statistics. And so in a growing network, each node corresponds to the level of, to the energy level of a Bose gas. And the larger the node's fitness, the smaller the energy level. So the fit get rich following a power law. And basically what he suggests is that those Bose-Einstein statistics can predict a phase transition from rich get richer to winner takes all, what they would then call the Bose-Einstein condensate. So what that suggests is that actually you can use quantum mechanics to go from brain networks that are separate to a certain moment when all those networks become one global network, and that could be on the moment that a decision, for example, is taken. Now, from an evolutionary point of view, where should free will come from? And Brems has written an interesting concept about it, in that he says that the basis of free will is actually flexible decision making. So in order to be unpredictable for predators, prey, or competitors, you should have some kind of variability. Because if you always do exactly the same, then you are very deterministic, even though that may be very efficient. But that comes at a cost. Maximum variability, where you do everything something different, is very inefficient as well. Now you would say, well, if you're fully deterministic, it should be indeed very efficient, but it is dangerous. Just as is known in fish, they have what is called C-start reflex, where if you give a stimulus on this side of the fish, then all these muscles will relax and these ones will contract, and that will basically create a C shape so that the fish swims away from the stimulus. Now, if that is built in, if that is a always model-free response, then that is fully deterministic. The problem is that there is sea snakes that create a wave that creates a C response, and then basically the fish will swim straight into the open mouth of the waiting snake, who uses a tail to send the signal to induce the C response. So basically the fact that the fish will always respond in the same way is not very compatible with long-term survival. So maximal random responses, where the fish always does something different, also does not work. So you have to have a balance between complete randomness and complete determinism, which is what we've seen before, regular or lattice topology in the brain, and the small world topology in between is generated by operant conditioning, because operant conditioning ultimately permits adaptive variability. So, and this adaptive variability is a balance between unpredictability and efficiency. Now, if this is there, then the question is, this allows animals to learn, and indeed already bees and crickets and fruit flies, they can make predictions, because ultimately operant conditioning is a prediction-based learning mechanism, where you predict that one stimulus will result in a certain behavior, and this behavior will in a certain context be optimal for that stimulus, and this becomes automatized, and that's operant conditioning. So basically you predict, or you transfer the reward to the prediction that predicts the reward. So ultimately you're depending on the intention and the context, you predict that will be the outcome, which will be beneficial, of course, and that will give a reward. And so operant conditioning is predicting that you will get that reward if you do this behavior. Now, where does free will operate? Of course, in between, and the small world topology, in between completely constrained, fully deterministic, which we've seen with the C-star reflex, and the fish that is not very compatible with long life, or random topology, where there is full randomness and that does not work. So basically, free will is associated or determined by small world topology. And therein comes then a new concept of free will, which is also generated by William James, but has been championed by many other philosophers such as Poincaré, Popper and Eccles, Doyle Dennett, Penrose, Fisher, Searle, Heisenberg, Olaf Brems. And basically the two-stage model says that first you generate behavioral options by chance. So free, there is a random generation of behavioral options, and then you select one option, and that's the will. So this is interesting because it allows some kind of freedom by combining randomness with determinism into a small world topology. However, if you have a certain intention, you make predictions, but these are not completely free, because they are constrained by memory, and they're also constrained by just brain capacity. You might generate 3, 4, 5 maybe different predictions, but not a completely unlimited set of predictions. And so the intention creates predictions that will then result in creative, or what you could call spontaneous, undeterministic generations of alternative options, which then, when you select one option, will become deterministic. And ultimately, which one you select is constrained by the environment and is constrained by your previous history of what you've learned through operant conditioning. So the brain potentially indeed makes multiple predictions, and then the prediction which best fits the sampling survives and becomes the percept. And if in doubt, actually the percept will switch between those predictions, such as in the Rubin phase and the Necker cube. So you can see either the faces, the black faces, or the white phase, but you can't see them both at the same time. Now, the fact that we have multiple predictions, that our brain generates multiple predictions simultaneously, is not unique to the sensory domain. Also genetically, we have what we call polymorphisms, and that just means that there is different forms of the same genes, which is common in nature, and that allows greater variability for adaptation by natural selection. So for example, you have just a change in one gene, and that will determine whether you become a black panther or whether you become a colored panther. It's just a polymorphism of the same gene. Now, as mentioned here, your brain generates multiple predictions, and then the prediction that best fits with updating in a Bayesian way from sensory input, this then will become the percept. That is ultimately Bayesian driven. So Bayesian statistics are suggest that what you do is you have a prior belief. And this prior belief then is updated by support for this prediction or not, and the support for the prior belief will result in a posterior belief, and a posterior belief is then the thought you have, the action that you do, the percept that you perceive. So that's Bayesian statistics, which is very similar to what we can call Darwinian evolution in biology, where You produce multiple individuals with some variation, and the variation of the individuals is like the variation in the predictions that you make in the brain, and then ultimately it's the environmental selection pressure that will determine which of these will be the fittest to survive. This is the same what you find in genetics, where there is multiple alleles, so polymorphism, and then the environment will determine which one will survive in that specific environment. And the same we proposed almost simultaneously with Donoso, that ultimately perception depends on multiple predictions, where you actively sample the environment, and that you get that the survival of the fittest prediction becomes the next percept, becomes the next thought, becomes the next action. And even in physics, there is apparently multiple quantum states where you get survival of the fittest quantum state depending on the environment. And interestingly, also this is a deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics. So the basic idea is that both in statistics, biology, genetics, perception, but also action and thought, and physics, so in neuroscience basically, that multiple forms are generated, and based on the environment, the fittest form is selected in all research domains that we currently know. So the multiple forms are basically the variability, and the selection of the fittest is the second phase in the free will concept. Now, what are the implications of the presence or absence of free will? And this has been pointed in the DSM-4 classification, in that an important loss of freedom is one of the possible defining features of mental disorders. So, for example, OCD and addiction are associated with a decrease in free will. And then the question is, when we treat the anterior cingulate, does that result in an increase in free will? And this is very interesting because in the same book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, Francis Crick already phrenologically proposed that free will was probably phrenologically located in the anterior cingulate gyrus. Now, can you modulate free will? Implanted electrodes have shown that if you stimulate the infraparietal area, the inferior parietal area, that people perceive an intention to move. So you just by stimulating the cortex and the inferior parietal area, then you get the people perceive an intention to move, and they report having moved, even in the absence of actual movement. EMG confirmed. So the perception of movement is dissociated from the signal that travels to the actual muscles. And when you stimulate the premotor area, that triggers limb and mouth movements, but they're not consciously detected by the patient. So there is the opposite. You can have movement without conscious perception, or if you stimulate the inferior parietal area, you get conscious perception of movement without having the movement actually occur. This is with implanted electrodes, but with transcranial magnetic stimulation, if you ask people to choose to lift one hand, irrespective of, they can choose left or right, doesn't matter, then right-handed people will normally choose the right hand 60% of the time. Now, if you TMS the right frontal cortex, actually 80% uses the left hand, but they still claim the choice was free. Now, it is critically important, the timing has to be within 200 milliseconds of the stimulus. So basically what that suggests is that when you TMS during the spontaneous movement, modulates the intention and movement perception. So, and the intention is actually perceived after the movement. So from a practical point of view, even though people say, well, I still made a free choice, it was not, because actually 80% of the time of people who would normally use their right hand will now use their left hand. And so with TDCS you see the same results. So in summary, that means that there is a dissociation between the conscious percept of that you that you have moved or not moved, and that you have chosen whether you move or not. So can we ultimately predict what we're going to do, even if we have not mentioned that? Well, if you use machine learning of fMRI data, then the decision to move can be predicted with still relatively low accuracy up to 10 seconds before they reach awareness. So you can predict whether somebody is going to move left or right hand long time before people are even aware that they will make that decision. And this is similar for abstract and non-movement intention. So it's not just a motor thing, which was one of the critics, and ultimately subliminal priming, so where you give somebody a stimulus but that is so fast or short that it is not consciously perceived, does modify your free will choice, and guessing seems to be very similar to free choices. So from a practical point of view, neuroscientifically, there's at least data that suggests that you can manipulate what people perceive as being free will. And of course you can go one step further and then say, well, if people can be modulated to still think they made a free choice, but ultimately it was the brain stimulation that created that feeling of freedom, then can psychosurgery improve free will? Now, psychosurgery goes back a long way to Gottlieb Burckhardt, who already before neurosurgery was basically a separate specialty, because that came with Victor Horsley and Harvey Cushing. He removed little bits, which is called a topectomy, in 6 patients from the frontal and temporal cortex for auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, aggression, excitement, and violence. And he had a 1/3 success rate. Basically, 2 of the patients died, 2 were unchanged, and 2 were quieter. I don't know if you can call it an improvement, but anyway, that was the first psychosurgery that was really performed. And then a little bit later, about 20 years later, Ludwig Pussep basically he cut between the motor and the sensory cortex in 3 patients with manic depressive psychosis, which was unsuccessful. And then in France, in the 30s of the last century, he used blood which was infected with malaria and injected that into the frontal lobes of 100 patients with sporadic schizophrenic and mania. And he noted that there was a uncontestable mental and physical amelioration. So just by injecting a blood which contains malaria, he, in the frontal cortex, improved the patients. And then Chavastel, also in France, did a similar treatment for 400 demented patients, and he saw an 80% cure rates. However, nowadays this treatment is not being used anymore. And then a very important moment for psychosurgery was the International Congress of Neurology in 1935. Because at that conference there was 3 presentations that actually drove to the development of psychosurgery. One was 2 neurophysiologists from, I think, Yale, Fulton and Jacobson. They described 2 chimpanzees which decreased frustration after frontal lobotomy. And then Penfield did a clinical study to show how much of the frontal lobe could be removed bilaterally without clinical devastating outcome. And then a third presentation at the same conference was from Brickner, who described the frontal lobotomy performed by the neurosurgeon Dandy for olfactory groove meningioma, which is basically a meningioma that grows here in the olfactory groove and can become extremely big. And that ultimately resulted in a failure of integration of various elements of behavior and cognition. So basically, they all three said by modifying frontal cortex or removing frontal cortex or cutting frontal cortex, you can change behavior. And Egas Moniz was there, who was from Portugal, and so they translated that very quickly to a human study where they had 20 patients undergo frontal leucotomy. So he came from frontal, and what he noted was 1/3 significantly improved, 1/3 improved, and in 1/3 there was no change. And in his text he wrote, well, prefrontal leucotomy is a simple operation, always safe, which may prove to be an effective surgical treatment in certain cases of mental disorder, because he had basically 2/3 who improved and 1/3 who significantly improved. This was picked up by Walter Freeman, and he changed the approach from a frontal to a more lateral approach. So instead of making multiple lesions in the front lobe coming from the top, he would come from the side and move his leucotome up and down to basically cut the frontal fibers. And then later on, because he got in disagreement with James Watts, who was a neurosurgeon, Walter Freeman was a psychiatrist, he developed a transorbital frontal lobotomy in 1946 to go, which can be done under local anesthesia, where the ice pick goes through the orbit and then does a frontal leucotomy without the requirement of a neurosurgeon. And so basically functional neurosurgery always goes through four phases, whether it is in for movement disorders or psychosurgery, it's the same. So for example, in movement disorders, as in Parkinson's disease, in the first phase, people really don't know what they're doing, so they make a large lesion to be sure it does something, with ultimately suboptimal results and many side effects. Then in the second phase, because there is a better target localization, for example via stereotactic tools, this allows you to make smaller lesions with better results. And then in the third phase, because L-DOPA came on the market, only those patients who do not respond to L-DOPA are still being treated surgically, again leading to poor results. And in the fourth phase, lesioning is replaced by reversible implants. That is what we saw in movement disorders. And in mental disorders, you saw the same four phases, where in the first phase, large frontal lobotomies are performed with suboptimal results and many side effects. In the second phase, stereotactic cingulotomies were performed, resulting in smaller lesions which improve results with less side effects. And in the third phase, after the introduction of chlorpromazine, which was the first medication that worked on the brain for psychiatric disease in 1953, only those patients who were resistant to psychopharmaca were still surgically retreated, again leading to a decrease in interest in behavioral neurosurgery, and now lesioning is being replaced by reversible implants. So initially, when Egas Moniz and Walter Freeman started, most people were very positive towards psychosurgery, because the asylums that were filled with thousands of people who could not be treated, basically those asylums were kind of prisons where they kept the so-called insane. There was at least 1/3 to maybe 1/2 of the people who were improved and who could live a normal life after the psychosurgical intervention. So people were very positive, and this culminated in Moniz receiving the Nobel Prize. After that period, then basically it was a more balanced opinion, where not everything that psychosurgery did was good. And then after the development of medication, actually it became negative, and psychosurgery was considered barbaric because there was a better treatment, which was medication. Now, based on that, the only problem was that some neurosurgeons, some psychosurgeons, such as Walter Freeman, even after the development of chlorpromazine, said, yeah, well, you can use chlorpromazine, but probably psychosurgery is still better, so they kept on using psychosurgery, and this has been called the Walter Freeman syndrome, based on work by William Shakespeare that says, the evil that man do lives after them, the good is often dirt with their bones, so let it be with Caesar, is mentioned in the play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare. And so the same can be related to Walter Freeman. Now, in 1977, when the 1970s in the US, there was a national commission that was organized for the protection of human subjects of biomedical and behavioral research, and they specifically had to investigate whether psychosurgery should be abandoned. And what it said is, well, we looked at the data and saw that they did not support our prejudice. So the chairman of the committee of the commission, Kenneth Ryan, basically said, I, for one, did not expect to come out in favor of psychosurgery, but we saw that some very sick people had been helped by it, and that it did not destroy their intelligence or rob them of their feelings. Their marriages were intact, they were able to work, the operation should not be banned. So the commission basically decided that psychosurgery should be allowed, maybe at less indications, but that it should not be banned. And so what is there now? There's still basically 4 main indications for psychosurgery: depression, OCD, bipolar disorder, and anxiety, and some less common indications such as violence, addiction, sexual aberration, and schizophrenia. Now, in 1947, the introduction of stereotactic approaches allowed to make very specific lesions, and a stereotactic approach is basically the same as a GPS system that says you exactly where in the brain you are. And so at that time a cingulotomy was developed by Hugh Cairns. Then the anterior capsulotomy was generated or developed by Talleyrand. The subcaudate tractotomy was developed by Geoffrey Knight, and the limbic leucotomy, which is basically a combination of the subcaudate tractotomy and the anterior cingulotomy. So now predominantly there is actually only 2 that remain, which is the anterior capsulotomy and the anterior cingulotomy. Now what is interesting is that with cingulotomy, you do not get any change in personality, general intelligence, memory, or executive function. It does reduce response intention and focused attention quite a little bit, but of course in certain pathologies that is already completely gone anyway. For example, in addiction, and there is only focused attention on the drug of addiction, and therefore, or the topic of addiction, and therefore reducing that hyper-focused attention may be actually beneficial. Capsulotomies do have some more side effects, in the sense that there is some problems with executive functioning, apathy and disinhibition, and weight gain. So capsulotomies are probably somewhat more interfering or generating more side effects than cingulotomies. Now what is interesting is that the same targets, the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior capsula, are used for DBS. So instead of making lesions in those areas, now electrodes are being implanted. Now, why would you target the anterior cingulum or the anterior capsula? Well, the anterior limb of the basically because they involve the same circuit. So to summarize, to make it very simple, the cingulum bundle goes from the amygdala to the cingulate cortex, and from there to the orbitofrontal cortex. Now the cingulate cortex has connections to the thalamus, and to the orbitofrontal cortex. And the amygdala, of course, connects to the hippocampus, and from the hippocampus you have the fornix that connects to the mammillary bodies, and the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus connects via the mammillothalamic tract to the thalamus. So basically you have one limbic circuit that is treated. Now if you do a cingulotomy, an anterior capsulotomy or subcaudate tractotomy, so if you do a subcaudate tractotomy, a cingulotomy, or an anterior capsulotomy, they all end up here in the pregeneral anterior cingulate. So that's what they have in common, and this is possibly mediated via the superior lateral branch of the medial forebrain bundle. So it really doesn't matter whether you target the network, this network. If you target that at this place, or that place, ultimately the effect that you have is in the pregeneral anterior cingulate. And what has been shown or proposed is that deep brain stimulation and non-invasive stimulation, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation or transcranial direct current stimulation, they target the same disease network. So it's not a phrenological target. What you want is to modify ongoing activity in a pathological network. So the idea is that if you target the area in the network, then you might have a result. If you target the pathology outside the network that you want to treat, then it won't work. So, and TMS or TDCS is only effective if it has functional connectivity to the disease network, and that makes sense. So if you treat Parkinson's disease here, because it is not connected to the network, or if you treat pain there, it won't work. But if you treat Parkinson's disease in the network, or has a connection to the network, or essential tremor or depression, then depending if your stimulation hits the network, the pathological network somewhere, it's fine. It doesn't really matter where you modify it. And this is of course the same for DBS as for non-invasive stimulation. So psychosurgery for pain was already done since the 1960s, and it has variable success for pain relief. The target is an area that actually is involved in the emotional or affective component of pain, basically meaning the suffering. So you take away the suffering of the pain, and the same target here can be used for pain relief, for OCD, and for addiction, with actually relatively high success rates for addiction. So for example, it has been suggested that if you do a cingulotomy there, that 80% of patients with morphine addiction improve, that 90% of patients with meperidine addiction improve, that 70% of patients with alcohol addiction and 60% of patients with heroin addiction improve by doing a cingulotomy, and that about 50% of the patients with OCD benefit, and about 50 to 75% of the patients with pain benefit. Now, who will benefit? Well, those you have to make your lesion a little bit, well, sufficiently anterior, because that is the difference between responders and non-responders. So the lesion should not be made in the posterior aspect of the dorsal. So basically, what you're treating is more uncertainty than the give me more. Now, can we get there? Can we get to that target non-invasively? Yes, you can. With a double coin coil TMS using a PET study, it has been shown that you can modify the activity there, and we've also shown it that you could target with EEG, that you can, in a sham controlled stimulation, that you can modify activity in that area. So here is a practical example where we treat a patient with alcohol addiction who had repeated relapses, who is refractory to other treatments, and is referred by a psychiatrist from a tertiary addiction hospital. 8 out of 10 score out of craving, and there is basically after this kind of TMS stimulation targeting the area which we know is involved in craving, then it drops to basically complete abolishment of craving. And what we see is that the EEG normalizes in the anterior cingulate after TMS associated with that improvement. Unfortunately, there was a rebound after 3 weeks. So the beneficial effect of 2 weeks of stimulation is only 2 to 3 weeks. Now, when you do an anterior capsulotomy, which is making a lesion there, ultimately what you're modifying is the pregeneral anterior cingulate cortex. So if you do an anterior capsulotomy for OCD, then you, why would you do that? Well, we know that in OCD there is hyperconnectivity in the anterior limb of the internal capsula, and that will result ultimately in these symptoms. So you have an increased metabolism in the subgeneral and the pregeneral, and predominantly in the subgeneral anterior cingulate cortex, and as well in the anterior limb of the internal capsula in patients with OCD. And the Y box, which is a measurement for the amount of OCD, correlates, however, with metabolism in the ACC and the PCC. And so basically, this determines how much OCD you will have. And so after capsulotomy, metabolism so after capsulotomy, basically what you see is that in this area, what correlates with the amount of OCD changes, even though the lesion is made in the anterior limb of the anterior lobe capsula. And the after the capsulotomy, what you see is that the Y box improvement is associated with the amount of change that you get in this area that we know is associated with OCD. So even though you make the lesion in the anterior limb of the internal capsula, the effect is caused by a change in the anterior cingulate cortex. So if you make lesions in the anterior capsula, 50 to 70% of OCD patients improve. And if you stimulate, you get about the same amount of patients who improve. So you can also lesion the nucleus accumbens. This has a beneficial effect on addiction in 65% of the patients, but for a short time, because 57 to 60% of the patients who had a benefit will actually relapse. And so you can also target the nucleus accumbens with an electrode, and there you see the same percentage of benefit. The question, of course, is also how long does it last and how does it work? Well, even though you put the electrode in the nucleus accumbens, which is part of your reward system, ultimately what changes is the connectivity to the pregeneral anterior cingulate cortex, and this seems to allow to get a better inhibition, because it's a starting point of the descending pain inhibitory pathway, the descending auditory inhibitory pathway, and maybe also for the descending anti-craving pathway. So then the question where we started with, is psychosurgery bad for individual freedom? Well, individual freedom can increase if you target the anterior cingulate cortex via cingulotomy or capsulotomy, because you decrease the urge for action and you reduce the uncertainty that drives the urge for action. So the accumbens modulation should increase free will by decreasing excessive suppression. So in conclusion, psychosurgery modulates the feedback of Bayesian prediction networks. And of course, these Bayesian prediction networks can dysfunction due to genetic polymorphisms, which lead to a change in receptor, for example, dopamine D2 receptors, but also epigenetic mechanisms may modify the activity of the Bayesian prediction networks. Most psychosurgical approaches target the anterior cingulate directly or indirectly. Predominantly, normalizing the balance between the give me more and the inhibit pathways. So this balance is disturbed in most psychiatric diseases, as we've seen, and so you rebalance it by changing activity here, which ultimately responds, which changes activity there as well, or the other way around. And psychosurgery can thereby increase individual freedom by reducing uncertainty, which drives the urge for action. And with that, I will take a break, and then after the break, we will continue with the different pathologies that you can treat with targeting the anterior cingulate cortex.